50 million Americans held their breath. J.D. Vance, standing tall beneath the blinding lights of live television, spoke the words that would shatter the polished facade of a billion-dollar promise. He struck where it hurt most, at the 1.5 billion truth, a truth hidden behind layers of contracts, speeches, and headlines. A truth that threatened to rob hardworking families of the future they were promised. Before the nation's eyes, Pete Buttigieg, the man trusted to safeguard America's progress, cracked under the weight of what could no longer be concealed. Cameras captured every flicker of panic, every word fumbled in defense of the indefensible. And as the chamber fell silent, a question echoed across America. If this could happen in plain sight, what else have we been kept from seeing? How deep does the betrayal run? And what price will working families pay? While this story draws from imagined moments and characters, it is carried by the very real feelings that many Americans hold close. The anger at injustice, the hope for change, the determination to fight for what is right. Though fictional in its telling, it echoes the truth of countless struggles and dreams. We invite you to listen, reflect, and connect, because sometimes the most profound truths come alive in stories told from the heart. Join us on this journey, a story that will challenge what you think you know and stay with you long after. The auditorium buzzed with excitement, a sea of vibrant banners fluttering against the crisp autumn air. Bright studio lights flooded the stage, casting a golden glow that shimmered off polished podiums and the eager faces in the crowd. Cameras swiveled and flashed, capturing every moment for millions watching from their living rooms. News anchors, their voices brimming with enthusiasm, declared it a historic moment for America, heralding the passage of a $1.5 billion infrastructure bill that promised to reshape the nation's future. At the center of this spectacle stood Pete Buttigieg. With steady confidence, he delivered a soaring speech that resonated through the hall and across the airwaves. He spoke of revitalized factories, bustling construction sites, and millions of new jobs for America's hardworking men and women. His words painted a picture of hope, a fresh dawn breaking over the rusted heartlands and quiet towns. A promise that prosperity would finally reach those who had been waiting far too long. The crowd erupted into applause, many faces alight with anticipation and belief. Yet amid the thunderous cheers and waving flags, one man sat still, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room with a penetrating gaze. J.D. Vance's jaw was set, his fingers curled tightly around a folded letter resting on his lap. The letter's paper was worn and creased, the ink faded from countless readings. It was a desperate plea from a steelworker in Ohio, a man whose hands once forged the backbone of America, but now trembled with uncertainty over his family's future. J.D.'s mind churned as he listened to the promises filling the air. The speeches, the headlines, the celebrations. They all sounded eerily familiar. We've heard this tune before, he thought bitterly, but the band always plays for someone else. His heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that beneath the polished speeches and well-rehearsed smiles, the truth often slipped quietly away from those who needed it most. Around him, the crowd swelled with optimism, but J.D.'s gaze flickered to the faces of the steelworkers' family etched in his memory. Empty chairs at dinner tables, sleepless nights, dreams deferred. The air of celebration felt like a fragile veil, concealing the deep fractures threatening to crack open. He wondered silently, how many others were swallowed by the promises, left in the cold, while the powerful moved forward? The atmosphere was electric, charged with hope and anticipation. Yet J.D.'s clenched fist and somber expression spoke of a different story, one waiting to be told, a shadow behind the spotlight. The question that hovered in the air was clear but unspoken. Beneath this historic deal, what was hidden? And how long before the truth shattered the illusion for everyone watching? As Pete's voice rose in a crescendo, painting visions of rebirth and renewal, J.D.'s mind raced with determination. This was only the beginning. Somewhere in the folds of the billion-dollar bill lay secrets that could change everything, and J.D. Vance was ready to find them, no matter the cost. A heavy silence enveloped him, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick marking moments slipping away, opportunities to act or stay silent. J.D.'s thoughts coalesced into a sharp resolve. He couldn't allow this to continue unchecked. The nation deserved transparency. The people deserved the truth. And those families whose futures hung in the balance deserved a champion. As he folded the documents carefully, a line echoed in his mind, crystallizing the pain and urgency of the moment. They're not just selling out steel, they're selling out our soul. The words burned with a truth that transcended politics, reaching into the very heart of what it meant to fight for justice. With the envelope now safely tucked away, JD switched off the lamp and sat back, steeling himself for the battle ahead. Tomorrow would bring the glare of scrutiny, the noise of opposition, and the fury of those who wished to keep this secret buried. But JD knew one thing clearly. Some truths demand to be heard, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn seeped through the window, it illuminated a man transformed, not just by discovery, but by the unyielding will to act. The fight for America's soul had just begun. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the curtains, JD paced restlessly across the worn hardwood floor of his living room. The house was quiet except for the steady rhythm of his footsteps and the distant chirping of early birds. The weight of the confidential documents pressed heavily on his mind, threatening to suffocate the fragile calm of the morning. His wife watched him carefully from the doorway, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and love. "This could destroy your career," she said softly, her voice trembling with the fear she tried to conceal. "Are you sure this is the path you want to take?" JD stopped pacing and turned to face her. His jaw was tight, his eyes resolute. "If a career means silence," he replied firmly, "then I don't want it." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the unspoken understanding between them filling the room more powerfully than words ever could. JD's mind drifted back to the previous day, the roaring applause that had filled the chamber as Pete Buttigieg took the stage, delivering promises of renewal and prosperity. The cheers had been thunderous, the optimism palpable. Yet beneath those polished speeches, JD had sensed a cavernous gap between the words and the harsh reality waiting to be uncovered. He replayed Pete's speech again in his mind, the cadence, the carefully crafted rhetoric, the smiles and confident gestures. But behind it all, JD heard something else, a silence filled with broken promises, unseen betrayals, and lives left hanging in the balance. That chasm between the public spectacle and the private truth grew wider with every passing second, gnawing at his conscience. He felt the magnitude of what was at stake. This wasn't just about a bill or a political maneuver. It was about the futures of thousands of American families, about the dignity of those who built this nation with their own hands. The decision before him was monumental and terrifying. To speak out would mean facing fierce opposition, risking his reputation, and enduring the relentless glare of the public eye. Yet to stay silent was to betray everything he believed in. JD ran his hands through his hair, frustration and determination swirling within him. His wife stepped closer, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide," she said gently, "know that you're not alone." That quiet support gave him strength. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but JD knew one thing with absolute clarity. Some truths are too important to hide. Some battles must be fought, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, JD folded the confidential documents once more and tucked them safely into his briefcase. The dawn was breaking, bringing with it the promise of a new day and the beginning of a fight that would change everything. Steeling himself, JD looked toward the window, watching the light spread across the sky. He was ready to step into the storm. The Senate chamber was buzzing with anticipation, its marble walls echoing the footsteps of politicians, aides, and press as they gathered for what was billed as a routine hearing on infrastructure oversight. Televised live to millions, the event promised to showcase bipartisan cooperation and the progress of the recently passed $1.5 billion infrastructure bill. News anchors, with their polished smiles and practiced tones, assured viewers this would be a feel-good session, a reassuring glimpse into government working smoothly for the people. JD left the bright lights and polished speeches behind, stepping into the cold gray reality of Ohio's forgotten industrial heartland. The once thriving steel mill now stood silent, its massive machines coated in rust and silence. Weeds cracked through the broken concrete floor like stubborn reminders that time had moved on without this place. The heavy scent of oil and decay hung thick in the air as JD walked slowly down the empty aisles, his footsteps echoing against cold steel beams. As he moved deeper inside, the hollow shell of the mill whispered stories of lost livelihoods and broken promises. From scattered groups of men and women nearby, voices rose, soft, bitter, and filled with years of waiting. One older man, his hands rough and scarred from decades at the forge, looked up and said, "They told us we'd be first in line for those jobs. 20 years I've waited. 20 years of seeing nothing but dust and silence." His eyes, tired but burning with quiet rage, met JD's. The words hung heavy between them, a testament to shattered hopes. Nearby, a foreman huddled with a small group, his voice low but urgent. "There's talk," he confided, "that the biggest chunk of that project's already been handed off to some giant overseas company. They say the work's not even coming back here." JD listened closely, feeling the weight of that betrayal settle deeper in his chest. This wasn't just about jobs, it was about trust, about the foundation of a community being quietly pulled from under their feet. JD paused beside a conveyor belt, now frozen in time, and stared out toward the fading light filtering through cracked windows. How can we rebuild a nation, he thought, if we don't trust its builders? The question echoed in his mind, mingling with the voices of the workers whose lives had been put on hold, whose futures were collateral damage in a game they never agreed to play. Yet despite the desolation, JD sensed something more, a simmering resolve beneath the surface. The people here weren't just waiting for work. They were waiting for justice, for someone to stand up and speak their truth. Their stories weren't just complaints. They were calls to action, echoes demanding to be heard beyond the hollow walls of this abandoned mill. The contrast between the grandeur of the political stage and the stark reality of this place was impossible to ignore. Where speeches had promised renewal, here was silence and decay. Where headlines spoke of progress, here lay the fractures beneath the surface. As JD stepped back into the fading daylight outside, his resolve hardened. The journey ahead would not be easy, but if this nation was to truly rise again, the voices from places like this mill could not be ignored. The promise of progress meant little without the people who build it. With that thought burning in his mind, JD prepared to take the fight from the shadows of rust and ruin back to the glare of the national spotlight, ready to expose the truths hidden beneath the surface, whatever the cost. Late into the quiet hours of the night, the office was cloaked in shadows, save for the soft glow of a desk lamp cutting through the darkness. JD sat hunched over his cluttered desk, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Just as he was about to call it a night, a faint rustle caught his attention. Sliding silently across the threshold was an unmarked envelope. No sender, no seal, just a plain white envelope resting against the door. Curiosity mixed with caution, JD picked it up and carefully peeled it open. Inside lay a stack of confidential documents, contract amendments stamped with official seals, but deliberately hidden from public view. His eyes quickly scanned the pages, but as he read deeper, his pulse quickened. A staggering figure emerged. 70% of the entire project's work was slated to be outsourced to foreign companies, entities notorious for exploitative labor practices, long hours, and unsafe working conditions. Each line he read felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just bureaucracy or routine outsourcing. This was a calculated decision that threatened to hollow out the very communities the bill was supposed to help. JD's mind flashed to the faces of families back home, steel workers who had lost decades of livelihood, single parents juggling multiple jobs, kids dreaming of stable futures. The betrayal was not abstract, it was deeply personal and heartbreakingly real. His fingers trembled slightly as he laid the papers down, the cold weight of reality settling in the room. This wasn't merely a misstep or oversight, it was a deliberate sellout, hidden behind layers of red tape and political theater. JD understood the gravity of what he now held. This information, once revealed, could ignite a firestorm far beyond the walls of Congress or the Capitol. It was a weapon, and it demanded to be wielded. As the morning sun filtered through towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished desks, Pete Buttigieg arrived with an air of unwavering confidence. Flanked by aides and greeted by flashing cameras, he moved gracefully toward the center of the stage. His demeanor was calm, almost charismatic, as reporters clamored for sound bites and microphones swiveled to catch his every word. The weight of expectation rested squarely on his shoulders, but Pete seemed poised, prepared to deliver his message of renewal and promise. In stark contrast, Vance sat quietly in the audience chamber, away from the spotlight but far from unnoticed. His posture was tense yet composed, his eyes sharp and calculating as they scanned the faces around him. In his hands, he clutched a stack of papers, the confidential amendments that held the key to a truth no one else was willing to confront. The contrast between Pete's assured public persona and JD's simmering determination was palpable. Around them, senators settled into their seats, some exchanging casual greetings while others whispered strategy in hushed tones. Staffers adjusted cameras and double-checked notes, all aware that the session was not just a formality, but a moment where power and truth could collide. Despite the festive atmosphere, a subtle undercurrent of tension rippled beneath the surface. The news broadcasts continued unabated, framing the hearing as a testament to progress and unity. Headlines flashed across screens nationwide. Infrastructure bill moving forward, bipartisan efforts yield results, jobs for America's future. The public, eager for signs of hope and renewal, tuned in with expectations set by these optimistic narratives. Yet JD's mind raced against the current of these stories. The documents he held threatened to unravel this carefully constructed facade. The question wasn't if he would speak up, it was when and how. As the gavel struck to open the session, silence swept over the chamber. All eyes turned to the witnesses and key figures, among them Pete Buttigieg, prepared to defend the project he championed. The stage was set, the players in place, and the world watching. JD tightened his grip on the papers, knowing the coming hours would test his resolve and challenge the very promises made to the nation. What began as a routine oversight hearing was about to become the crucible where truth and deception would face off, live, unfiltered, and irreversible. As the hearing commenced, the air inside the Senate chamber grew heavy with anticipation. Vance rose from his seat, his demeanor calm but resolute. His voice, measured and respectful, carried through the room as he addressed Pete Buttigieg directly. "Secretary Buttigieg," JD began, "can you provide this committee with assurance that not a single job created under this $1.5 billion infrastructure bill will be outsourced overseas?" Pete, poised behind the podium, responded with practiced ease, his tone smooth and confident. He leaned heavily on statistics and well-rehearsed platitudes. "This administration is fully committed to revitalizing American industry," Pete declared, flashing charts illustrating job growth, projections, and investment figures. "Our priority is, and always will be, to create meaningful employment opportunities for American workers." The cameras captured every word, the nation watching closely. Yet beneath the polished exterior of his answers, JD detected a subtle hesitance, a flicker of uncertainty that went unnoticed by many. Sensing the moment to press harder, JD tightened his line of inquiry, his questions growing sharper and more direct. "Secretary," JD continued, "there have been reports suggesting that a significant portion of the contracted work has already been subcontracted to foreign firms known for exploitative labor practices. Can you categorically deny these allegations here today?" A brief pause hung in the air. For the first time, Pete's composure wavered. His eyes darted momentarily toward his aides before returning to meet JD's unyielding gaze. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the question sinking deep. "Those reports are misleading," Pete finally replied, his voice firmer but less certain. "We have stringent oversight measures to ensure compliance with American labor laws and to maximize domestic job creation." Millions tuned in live, their collective breath held as the exchange unfolded. The tension was palpable, a charged atmosphere where the stakes transcended politics, touching the lives of countless families across the country. JD's questions peeled back the layers of gloss carefully applied to the bill. With each pointed inquiry, He chipped away at the narrative of progress and prosperity, revealing cracks that threatened to fracture the carefully maintained image. Pete, feeling the pressure mount, resorted to repetition of talking points, but the undercurrent of doubt was now visible. The polished speech gave way to defensive maneuvers as the spotlight intensified. As JD pressed on, the committee members shifted in their seats, the room alive with whispers and exchanged glances. The battle had begun, a clash not just of words, but of truths competing for the nation's attention. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every nuance, every pause, every flicker of emotion. The world was watching, waiting to see if the promises made under the banner of renewal would hold firm or crumble under scrutiny. In that moment, JD's presence was undeniable, a relentless force challenging the status quo, willing to confront the uncomfortable truths that many preferred to ignore. The first blow had been struck, but the fight was far from over. And for millions across America, the question lingered. What else was hiding beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed? JD took a slow, deliberate breath as he reached into his briefcase and pulled out the confidential amendments, documents carefully concealed from public view until this very moment. His voice, calm and unwavering, echoed through the Senate chamber as he began to read aloud. Each word carried the weight of a revelation long suppressed, a truth too inconvenient for polished speeches and hopeful promises. As per Amendment 47B, 70% of the contracted work under this infrastructure bill is to be subcontracted to foreign firms, many of which have documented histories of labor violations and exploitative practices, JD declared, his eyes scanning the faces before him. The chamber, once buzzing with polite attentiveness, suddenly grew hushed. Gasps erupted across the room. Some senators exchanged startled glances. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. The air thickened with shock and tension, as if the very foundations of trust had been cracked wide open. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment this bombshell was dropped live for the entire nation to witness. In the sea of faces, Pete Buttigieg's expression shifted dramatically. The confidence that had accompanied him moments before gave way to a flicker of panic. Sweat began to beat at his temple, his jaw tightened, and his eyes darted nervously, searching for footing amid the sudden upheaval. The weight of JD's revelation landed squarely on him, exposing a vulnerability rarely seen in such public arenas. As JD continued reading, the clauses unfolded like a dam breaking. Details of how contracts were funneled through shell companies abroad, the economic impact on local industries, and the hidden compromises made behind closed doors laid bare the extent of the outsourcing scandal. Each phrase chipped away at the carefully constructed narrative of job creation and national renewal. Yet amidst the shock, JD's tone remained measured. He was not there to incite hysteria, but to illuminate a truth that demanded attention and accountability. His gaze held steady, locking with that of Pete's across the chamber, silently challenging him to respond. Not with words of denial, but with transparency. The viewers at home watched intently, many holding their breath as the tension mounted. Social media feeds lit up instantly with reactions, ranging from outrage to disbelief, sparking a nationwide conversation about what had been hidden in plain sight. Behind the scenes, aides scrambled to regroup, political strategists whispered urgent counsel, and journalists prepared to pivot their coverage toward this unfolding crisis. What had been anticipated as a routine hearing had transformed into a battleground of truth versus deception. As JD concluded the reading, the chamber remained suspended in a charged silence. The moment marked a turning point, a fracture in the facade that many hoped would remain intact. The question now loomed large. How would those entrusted with the nation's future respond to this undeniable exposure? For JD, this was more than a political maneuver. It was a call to action. The document was not merely paper, it was a testament to the struggles of millions of Americans whose voices had been drowned out by promises broken and deals struck behind closed doors. As the gavel poised to signal the next phase of the hearing, JD's heart steadied. The truth had been laid bare, and the fight for justice had truly begun. Pete Buttigieg's reaction was immediate and fierce. With a forceful slam of his palm against the polished oak table, he broke the heavy silence that had settled over the chamber. "This is a distortion," he declared, his voice sharp and edged with frustration. "You're jeopardizing real progress for nothing more than political gain." His words echoed off the marble walls, reverberating through the rows of senators and staffers who sat wide-eyed, sensing the magnitude of the moment. But J.D. Vance remained unmoved. His gaze was steady, voice calm, yet resolute as he responded without hesitation. "Progress at the cost of our workers isn't progress," he said firmly. "It's surrender." His words cut through the tension like a blade, drawing a hush that rippled through the room. The clash was no longer just a debate over policy. It had transformed into a battle over principles, integrity, and the future of American labor. Around the chamber, senators shifted uneasily in their seats. Some exchanged wary glances, their faces betraying the weight of the decision looming before them. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of charged silence that only history-making moments can summon. Every eye was fixed on the two men, their starkly opposing positions illuminating the fault lines running through the very heart of the government's promises. Pete's features tightened, his usually composed demeanor giving way to visible signs of strain. Yet he pressed on, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "You fail to see the complexity of these deals," he argued, gesturing toward the documents. "There are global factors at play, regulations and partnerships that require nuance and understanding beyond simple accusations." JD's reply was measured but unwavering. "Nuance should never come at the expense of the people who built this country," he countered. "We owe it to them to demand accountability, not excuses." His voice carried the weight of countless families whose livelihoods had been sidelined, a reminder that policies are not abstract concepts but the lives of real people. As the exchange intensified, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras focused. The world beyond those walls was watching too. The stakes were monumental. This wasn't just about a bill, but about trust, transparency, and the very definition of progress. Senators who had remained silent now began murmuring among themselves, some nodding subtly in agreement with JD's stance, others glancing toward Pete with a mixture of concern and calculation. The clash had exposed a divide not just in opinion, but in vision, one side championing sweeping reforms and global engagement, the other demanding a return to foundational values and protection for the nation's workers. Throughout it all, JD maintained a composed intensity, his every word deliberate and charged with purpose. He knew that this confrontation was only the beginning, that beneath the polished surfaces and political rhetoric lay a deeper battle for the soul of the nation. As Pete took a brief pause, searching for a way to pivot the conversation, JD's eyes locked onto his opponents with unyielding determination. The moment hung suspended, a clear signal that neither would relent easily. This hearing had become a crucible, forging the path for what could be a turning point in American politics. Outside the chamber, the growing swell of public interest and media frenzy suggested that whatever happened next, the consequences would echo far beyond these marble walls. The battle lines were drawn, and history was quietly being written in real time. Within minutes of J.D. Vance's revelation in the Senate chamber, news outlets across the country seized the story, broadcasting the bombshell to millions. Headlines flashed rapidly on screens and scrolling tickers, proclaiming infrastructure bill outsourcing scandal exposed, J.D. Vance unmasks hidden truth behind $1.5 billion project, and national outcry grows over American jobs outsourced abroad. The intensity of the moment sent ripples far beyond the Capitol, capturing the attention of a nation hungry for answers. Social media platforms ignited like wildfire. Within moments, the hashtag #StandWithJD surged to the top of trending lists nationwide. Thousands of posts poured in from all corners of America. Workers, families, veterans, and everyday citizens shared their stories of hardship, frustration, and hope. Videos of the hearing were replayed and dissected, accompanied by impassioned commentary and calls for justice. The virtual conversation became a battleground of voices united by a common demand: accountability and protection for American workers. As news cameras turned their lenses outward, crowds began to gather outside the Capitol. The early morning calm gave way to a swelling chorus of determination and protest. Men and women, Many clad in worn work boots and weather jackets held homemade signs aloft. Simple but powerful messages like, "Our jobs, our future, stop selling out America, and protect our steelworkers." Their faces bore the marks of years of struggle, yet their eyes shone with renewed hope, ignited by JD's courage. The chants and footsteps echoed through the streets, weaving together a tapestry of resilience and resolve. For many, this was more than a protest. It was a reclaiming of dignity and a call for a nation to honor the hands that built it. Families stood side by side, sharing stories of lost wages, shattered dreams, and the longing for a stable tomorrow. Inside the Capitol, senators and staffers could no longer ignore the groundswell of public emotion. The weight of their constituents' voices pressed upon the legislative halls, demanding urgent action. Behind closed doors, conversations turned heated, alliances shifted, and the political landscape began to tremble beneath the growing storm. Yet amid the rising tide of unrest, JD remained focused. He knew that public support was crucial, but the battle ahead required strategic precision and unwavering commitment. This moment was not an endpoint. It was the spark for a larger movement aimed at reclaiming the promise of America for its people. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the bustling city, the world watched as a nation awakened. The story that began with a single document in a quiet office had transformed into a powerful call to action, echoing through homes, workplaces, and hearts across the country. And at the center of it all stood JD Vance, a man determined to turn truth into change, to ensure that the voices of the many were no longer drowned out by the interests of the few. The backlash was swift and relentless. Within hours of the hearing's explosive moments, whispers turned into headlines. Allies of Pete Buttigieg, well-connected and well-funded, began leaking stories to the press. The narrative they spun was calculated and sharp. JD Vance was reckless, a disruptive force undermining progress, an opportunist seeking personal gain at the expense of national unity. Tabloids and opinion pieces echoed these claims, painting JD as a dangerous maverick rather than a champion of truth. Inside JD's campaign headquarters, the atmosphere grew tense. Calls from longtime donors slowed to a trickle before drying up entirely. Their support wavered by the tide of negative press. His team worked overtime, scrambling to counter the narrative, but the weight of the smear campaign bore heavily on morale. Even the security detail was heightened after subtle but unmistakable threats began arriving at the office. Letters slipped under doors, eerie phone calls in the dead of night. The battle was no longer confined to the Senate floor. It had spilled into every corner of JD's life. Yet despite the storm, JD remained a figure of calm resolve. One evening, standing before a large window overlooking the Capitol steps, he watched the swelling crowd below. Workers, families, and everyday Americans united by a shared sense of betrayal and hope. Their faces were lit by flickering candlelight in the glow of their smartphones streaming the hearing live. The chants and murmurs of support echoed faintly up to his apartment. JD's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the scene. "Let them come," he muttered under his breath. "I'm not backing down." The words were not just a declaration, but a promise. The smear campaign, the threats, the attempts to silence him, they were obstacles, not barriers. His fight was bigger than politics. It was about restoring faith in a nation that had too long been sold out from within. Behind that quiet determination lay a deeper fire, a belief that the truth, once uncovered, could not be buried forever. The workers he represented were counting on him, their futures hanging in the balance. JD knew that the path ahead was perilous, but retreat was not an option. As night deepened, the city's lights flickered against the dark sky. The Capitol stood majestic and silent, a symbol of the ideals JD fought to protect. Despite the mounting pressure, the resolve in his eyes burned brighter than ever. The battle was far from over, but so was his will to see it through, no matter the cost. The next day would bring new challenges, new headlines, and new tests of courage. But in that moment, as he stood watching the people rallying beneath him, JD felt a surge of strength. The tide was turning, and the truth was on his side. In the days following the Senate hearing, JD Vance found himself plunged deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and deception. Late nights in his office blurred into early mornings as he sifted through stacks of documents, emails, and financial records that had surfaced through discrete channels. Each page seemed to reveal another layer of corruption, cost inflation disguised under technical jargon, backdoor lobbying by foreign firms weaving their influence through shadowy corridors of power. The more JD uncovered, the more the web tightened around those who sought to keep the truth hidden. A trusted colleague, someone with deep knowledge of political maneuvering and the inner workings of the industry, met with JD in a quiet, dimly lit cafe away from prying eyes. Leaning in close, the colleague's voice dropped to a grave whisper. "They'll bury you alive if you keep digging. Powerful people don't take kindly to being exposed. You need to be careful." JD met the warning with a steely gaze. "Then I'll claw my way out," he replied firmly, his resolve unshaken. The fight was no longer just about exposing a single contract. It had become a battle against an entrenched system willing to sacrifice workers and communities for profit. Every revelation was a blow to that system, and JD knew the cost would be high. Despite the looming threats and increasing pressure, JD's commitment only deepened. The faces of the steelworkers, the families struggling to make ends meet, haunted his thoughts. This was more than politics. It was justice for those left behind. He coordinated with investigative journalists and legal experts, building a network to ensure the truth would reach the public no matter the obstacles. Each new document told a story of greed and betrayal, hidden fees, padded budgets, contracts awarded to foreign firms with known labor violations, lobbying efforts to suppress dissent. The scale of deception was staggering and the implications profound. It was clear this was not an isolated misstep, but a coordinated effort to undermine American labor for financial gain. JD's team worked tirelessly to verify facts and prepare for the inevitable backlash. The stakes were growing with each passing day, but so was public awareness. As the revelations trickled into the media, community groups and unions began to mobilize, their voices adding momentum to the growing demand for accountability. In moments of quiet reflection, JD would sometimes stare out his office window, watching the city pulse with life below. The struggle ahead was daunting, but his belief in the cause remained unshaken. "If they want to bury me," he thought, "they haven't counted on how hard I'll fight to rise again." The journey was far from over, and the deeper JD dug, the clearer it became. This was a defining moment, not just for him, but for the soul of a nation yearning for truth and fairness. The murmurs of discontent quickly grew into a powerful roar as worker rallies swelled across the nation, starting from the steps of the Capitol and spreading like wildfire to the industrial towns that had long been the backbone of America. Streets once quiet now echoed with the pounding of thousands of boots, the rhythm of chants demanding justice and fairness. Banners fluttered proudly in the autumn breeze, emblazoned with simple yet powerful messages. "Protect our jobs. American workers deserve better. And stop outsourcing our future." JD Vance moved through the crowds with a purposeful calm. He shook hands with steelworkers whose calloused palms told stories of decades of toil, listened intently to mothers who spoke of nights worrying if their children would have a future in the towns they called home. Everywhere he went, the faces told the same story: hardship, hope, and a hunger for change. An elderly veteran, his uniform weathered and worn, grasped JD's shoulder firmly, his eyes shining with a mixture of relief and renewed faith. "It's been a long time since I believed in someone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The words struck JD deeply, reminding him of the weight of the responsibility he carried, not just as a politician, but as a symbol of resilience and truth for those who had been forgotten. The atmosphere was electric but grounded in genuine connection. It was a gathering not just of protest, but of community, a collective rising of voices that had been silenced for too long. Stories were shared about factories closed overnight, families torn apart by layoffs, and dreams deferred by deals struck behind closed doors. Yet amid the pain, there was an unmistakable spark of hope fueled by JD's unwavering commitment to fight for their cause. Back in Washington, the growing movement placed immense pressure on lawmakers. The once-staid halls of Congress buzzed with urgency and debate as senators and representatives grappled with the swelling public outcry. Calls for investigations, Hearings and reforms filled the agenda, and the political landscape began to shift in response to the tide of voices demanding accountability. Despite the mounting opposition from powerful interests, JD remained a steady beacon amidst the storm. He continued to meet with community leaders, union representatives, and everyday citizens, forging bonds that transcended political lines. Each handshake, each story, strengthened his resolve and deepened his understanding of what was truly at stake. The protests didn't just stay confined to the capital. From Ohio to Pennsylvania, Michigan to Indiana, rallies erupted, workers standing shoulder to shoulder in factories, town squares, and city streets. The movement was no longer a whisper, it had become a roar impossible to ignore. As JD stood among the crowd during a chilly evening rally, the setting sun cast long shadows over the faces lifted toward the stage. The air was thick with determination and the unspoken promise that this fight was theirs to win. He raised his voice, not just as a senator, but as a man who understood the pain and pride of the American worker. "This is our moment," he said, his words carried on the crisp air. "We will no longer be sidelined. Our jobs, our families, our communities, they matter. Together, we will reclaim the future we deserve." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound a thunderous affirmation that the people had risen and that their fight for justice had truly begun. The nation's airwaves were soon filled with contrasting voices, reflecting a country deeply divided. Pete Buttigieg stepped up to the podium at a highly anticipated press conference, flanked by aides in the gleaming backdrop of the Capitol. His expression was calm but resolute as he addressed the swirling controversy. "Pragmatism is not betrayal," he declared firmly, his voice carrying the weight of political conviction. "We face complex realities, and this deal represents a necessary step forward to modernize our infrastructure and compete globally. Sacrifices must be made in pursuit of progress." Pete's words echoed through the media, accompanied by carefully crafted statements emphasizing job growth projections and long-term economic benefits. His defense painted the infrastructure bill as a pragmatic solution to urgent challenges, urging the public to look beyond short-term discomfort for the greater good. Yet as Pete's message circulated, JD Vance was preparing his own response. Not in a gleaming press room, but in the humble setting of a recently reopened union hall. The walls, once bare and cold, were now adorned with banners celebrating the return of American manufacturing jobs. Here, surrounded by the very people impacted by the outsourcing deal, JD's tone was fierce and unyielding. "Pragmatism without conscience is betrayal," JD told the crowd, his voice ringing with conviction. "When progress demands the sacrifice of our workers, it ceases to be progress. It becomes surrender." The room erupted with applause and nods of agreement. The steel workers, truck drivers, and factory employees in attendance knew firsthand the human cost behind political compromises and empty promises. The divide rippled across the nation. Media outlets and social platforms buzzed with debate, JD hailed by some as a fearless hero standing up for the forgotten, while others labeled him a saboteur, undermining vital progress. Opinion columns dissected the arguments, politicians took sides, and families found themselves caught in the middle of a growing ideological rift. Across small-town diners and metropolitan offices alike, conversations sparked. Was J.D. Vance the voice of truth, holding power accountable? Or was Pete Buttigieg's call for pragmatism the realistic approach needed in a complex, interconnected world? The question fractured communities and challenged long-held beliefs about loyalty, progress, and justice. Amid the cacophony, J.D. remained grounded. His message was simple yet powerful, a call to prioritize people over profits, to demand integrity from those who claim to serve the public good. For the workers he represented, the fight was personal and the stakes were high. Meanwhile, Pete's camp doubled down, rallying supporters with data and assurances that tough decisions were necessary. But the emotional undercurrent stirred by JD's rally resonated deeply, turning political rhetoric into a human story of struggle and resilience. The nation stood at a crossroads, split by competing visions of progress and patriotism. The question loomed large. Could America reconcile pragmatism with principle, or would this divide deepen, threatening the very fabric of unity? As JD prepared to take his fight to the Senate floor once more, The world watched, waiting to see if courage and conscience could prevail over expediency and compromise. Under mounting public pressure and the growing swell of protests, Congress moved swiftly, fast-tracking an emergency vote to decide the fate of the controversial infrastructure deal. The urgency was palpable, no longer just a legislative matter, but a reckoning with the trust and future of millions of Americans. News cameras captured the frenetic activity as lawmakers hurried through corridors, briefings intensified, and political alliances were tested like never before. Lobbyists descended in full force, flooding offices with persuasive arguments, confidential briefings, and veiled threats. Their presence was everywhere, in whispered conversations behind closed doors, in last-minute phone calls, and in meticulously crafted memos aimed at swaying wavering votes. The stakes were high, billions of dollars hung in the balance, and the pressure to maintain the deal was immense. The battle was no longer just public opinion, but a complex game of power, influence, and strategy. Amid the political whirlwind, J.D. Vance found a moment of solemn reflection. He traveled to a steelworkers' memorial, a place etched with the names of those who had devoted their lives to the industry that built the nation. Standing before the cold, unyielding granite, J.D. knelt and laid a wreath, a symbol not only of remembrance but of renewed commitment. His fingers brushed the inscription, a quiet vow resonating deep within him. "This is who I fight for." The memorial was more than stone and metal. It was a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of the American worker. J.D. felt the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders, but also drew strength from the legacy of those who came before. They had weathered storms, stood up to injustice, and forged a path that he was determined to continue. Returning to the Capitol, J.D. steeled himself for the decisive vote. The corridors buzzed with anticipation, senators and representatives exchanging hurried words, weighing their choices under the watchful eyes of their constituents and the nation. The outcome was uncertain, the political currents swirling unpredictably, but the energy was electric, a climax building toward a moment that would shape the country's economic and moral landscape. As the chamber filled, J.D.'s mind raced with thoughts of the workers, the families, and the communities hanging in the balance. Each vote cast would ripple beyond the marble walls, touching lives in towns and cities far from the nation's capital. The fight was no longer theoretical, it was deeply personal. When the gavel finally signaled the beginning of the vote, a hush fell over the room. Senators rose one by one, their decisions carrying the hopes and fears of millions. The tension was palpable. Each name called was met with murmurs, gasps, or silence. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the gravity of the event to an audience riveted by the unfolding drama. J.D. watched closely, his heart pounding with every passing second. The outcome was more than a tally of votes. It was a verdict on justice, accountability, and the promise of protecting American workers from betrayal. Whatever the result, J.D. knew this day would be remembered as a pivotal chapter in the fight for economic dignity and national integrity. Outside, supporters gathered in quiet anticipation, their faces etched with hope and determination. They awaited the decision that would either affirm their struggle or challenge them to continue the battle. The air was thick with emotion, a collective breath held in unity. As the final votes were counted, the chamber erupted in reaction. Whether in cheers or stunned silence, the message was clear. The nation was watching, and the fight for its future had reached a defining moment. The Senate chamber was charged with an electric tension that seemed to pulse through the air itself. Senators sat rigid, eyes fixed on the podium where J.D. Vance stood, his posture composed but radiating fierce determination. Cameras swiveled to capture every movement, every inflection of voice, broadcasting live to an audience that spanned the nation. The weight of the moment was unmistakable. This was no ordinary debate, but a decisive showdown that could reshape the future of American labor and the promises made in the halls of power. J.D. began with precision, his words cutting through the murmur of anticipation. He methodically unraveled the contract's hidden costs and the web of betrayals concealed beneath layers of legal jargon and political spin. "This contract," he stated, voice steady yet commanding, "does not represent progress. It represents a quiet surrender of our workers' futures. He detailed how billions were funneled away from American hands, how subcontracting to foreign firms with questionable labor practices undercut the very communities the bill purported to uplift. The chamber absorbed his every word, some senators nodding subtly, while others clenched their jaws. JD's rhetoric was sharp but grounded in empathy. He spoke not just as a politician, but as a voice for the countless families whose livelihoods depended on the outcome. He recounted stories from steelworkers and factory employees, weaving their struggles into the larger narrative of economic justice. The human cost behind the numbers became undeniable. As he neared his conclusion, JD's voice grew impassioned. "We must ask ourselves," he declared, "do we stand with our people, those who built this country with sweat and sacrifice, or do we sell them for parts, fragments of profit and political expediency?" The question hung in the air, charged with moral urgency. The chamber fell into a heavy silence, the gravity of the choice laid bare before every senator. Opponents of JD's stance shifted uncomfortably, their arguments blunted by the clarity and conviction of his message. Attempts to deflect or minimize the issue were met with quiet but resolute skepticism. The hearing had transformed from a routine session into a crucible, testing the core values of representation and accountability. Throughout his speech, JD maintained eye contact with his colleagues, challenging them not only intellectually but emotionally. His presence was a reminder that policies affect real lives and that leadership demands courage to confront inconvenient truths. The room, thick with anticipation, seemed to lean in collectively, awaiting the response that would signal the direction of the nation's future. When JD stepped back from the podium, the chamber erupted into a flurry of whispered conversations and exchanged glances. Senators whispered among themselves, their faces etched with the weight of responsibility. Outside the chamber, news crews buzzed, preparing to deliver the dramatic moments to a public hungry for justice and clarity. For millions watching from home, JD's words resonated deeply. The question he posed was no longer rhetorical, it was a call to action, a challenge to reclaim a future where the dignity of labor was honored above all else. In that charged moment on the Senate floor, the battle for America's economic soul was clear. Progress measured not in profits alone, but in the prosperity of the people who make the country strong. The showdown had reached its climax, and the nation held its breath, waiting to see which path would be chosen. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as the clerk began calling the roll for the vote on the motion to halt the controversial infrastructure deal. Each senator's name echoed clearly, their voices steady but heavy with the weight of the decision. The eyes of the nation were fixed on the chamber, millions watching live as the fate of the bill, and perhaps much more, hung in the balance. As the votes were tallied, tension mounted with every passing second. Whispers filled the room, senators exchanged brief, anxious glances, and aides hovered at the edges, waiting for the final count. It was a razor-thin margin, each vote a battleground between competing visions for America's future. When the clerk finally announced the results, the chamber seemed to hold its collective breath. The motion to halt the deal had passed, just barely. Applause erupted spontaneously in the gallery as supporters of the motion cheered and embraced, their relief and joy palpable. The victory, though narrow, was a powerful statement that the voices of the workers and communities affected had been heard. Meanwhile, Pete Buttigieg sat at his desk, the confident facade slipping away, his head lowered, eyes downcast, as the weight of defeat settled over him. The silence around him was deafening, a stark contrast to the applause ringing out elsewhere. It was a moment of reckoning, a public acknowledgement that the promises made had fallen short in the eyes of the nation. JD Vance, standing among the supporters, allowed himself a brief, controlled smile. The battle was far from over, but this victory was a crucial step, a validation of the fight to bring transparency and fairness back to the forefront. He understood the gravity of the moment not only for himself, but for the countless Americans who had placed their trust in him. Outside the Capitol, crowds gathered, their cheers spilling into the streets. The news spread rapidly, carried by journalists, social media, and word of mouth. The narrow victory sparked a surge of hope and renewed energy in communities long battered by economic uncertainty. Back inside the chamber, conversations began to shift. Lawmakers who had wavered found new resolve, realizing the power of public opinion and the importance of accountability. The political landscape was altered, the stakes raised higher for all involved. For JD, the victory was bittersweet. He knew that passing the motion was not the end, but a beginning, a signal that the fight for justice, for the American worker, would continue. There would be resistance, setbacks, and sacrifices ahead. Yet in this moment, the possibility of real change felt tangible. As the session adjourned, JD took a moment to look around the chamber, at the faces of colleagues, supporters, and opponents alike. The lines had been drawn clearly, the challenge set. The road forward would demand courage, perseverance, and unwavering commitment. Stepping outside into the fresh air, JD felt the weight of history on his shoulders, but also the strength of a movement growing with every passing day. The fight to protect America's workers, to hold those in power accountable, was far from over, but the tide was turning. In that decisive vote, the nation had spoken, and J.D. Vance was ready to answer the call. J.D. stepped out of the Senate chamber and into a sea of faces, thousands of workers, families, and supporters who had gathered outside the Capitol, their cheers rising like a thunderous wave. The air was thick with emotion. Tears streamed freely down weathered cheeks. Embraces were exchanged between strangers, united by a shared victory, and voices lifted in triumphant chants. It was a moment that transcended politics, a raw and powerful celebration of justice claimed after a long and arduous battle. News cameras flashed, capturing the scenes of jubilation and relief. Reporters hurried to record interviews with steelworkers, factory employees, and union leaders who spoke with renewed hope and fierce pride. Across television networks and online platforms, headlines exploded. Vance leads historic rejection of outsourcing deal. Victory for American workers. A nation stands with its builders. The story spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in homes, workplaces, and social circles nationwide. Amid the cheers, JD found a moment to step aside, slipping into a quiet corner away from the roaring crowd. The sounds of celebration softened as he leaned against a stone pillar, letting the weight of the day settle over him. The magnitude of what had been achieved and the immense responsibility it carried weighed heavily on his shoulders. This was not just a personal triumph, it was a victory for the countless families whose futures had been uncertain for too long. As he closed his eyes briefly, JD reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the dusty floors of shuttered steel mills to the grand halls of power. The faces of the workers he had met along the way flickered through his mind, their stories of struggle and resilience fueling his resolve. He felt a surge of gratitude for their trust and an unshakable commitment to continue fighting on their behalf. Yet beneath the elation lay the sobering reality that the battle was far from over. The defeated opponents would regroup, the political games would continue, and the systemic challenges facing American workers would persist. But for now, this moment of victory was a beacon, proof that truth, courage, and persistence could shake even the most entrenched systems. JD straightened, inhaled deeply, and rejoined the crowd. The celebration around him was not merely about a vote, it was about reclaiming hope, dignity, and a future where the promise of work and justice could be realized. It was a testament to the power of standing up when it mattered most. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the Capitol steps, JD's smile was quiet but genuine. The road ahead would demand even greater strength and sacrifice. But tonight, the nation had spoken. And together, they had taken a crucial step toward rebuilding a country that worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. Following the historic vote that halted the outsourcing deal, J.D. Vance stepped confidently back into the political arena, determined not to let the momentary victory fade into forgotten promises. He introduced a bold new bill aimed squarely at revitalizing American industry by prioritizing domestic jobs in all federally funded infrastructure projects. The legislation was ambitious. It mandated strict requirements that contracts be awarded only to companies committed to employing American workers and sourcing materials domestically. JD's vision resonated deeply with communities long battered by economic neglect. The bill symbolized more than policy. It was a pledge to restore the dignity and stability that had been stripped away from countless families. The message was clear. The era of empty promises was over. This time, real change was within reach. Across the nation, grassroots volunteers answered the call with enthusiasm and determination. Local initiatives sprang to life, driven by citizens united in purpose. Town halls filled with passionate discussions about reopening shuttered factories, retraining displaced workers, and investing in sustainable industries. In once abandoned plants, community members organized cleanup efforts, fundraising drives, and apprenticeship programs, breathing life back into spaces that had long symbolized decline. These efforts weren't limited to industrial hubs. Small towns and rural areas joined the movement, recognizing that economic renewal was a shared goal. Volunteers of all ages lent their hands and hearts, from seasoned union members to young activists eager to make a difference. Their work sparked a tangible sense of hope, weaving together the threads of community pride and collective responsibility. Media outlets captured these stories of revival, highlighting everyday heroes working tirelessly to rebuild the backbone of America. Interviews with workers returning to the floor, families regaining stability, and business owners committing to local hiring painted a vivid picture of a nation on the mend. The narrative shifted from despair to determination, inspiring others to join the growing wave of support. Within Congress, JD's bill faced scrutiny and debate, but the groundswell of public backing made opposition increasingly difficult. Lawmakers found themselves confronted not just by political calculations, but by the voices of constituents demanding accountability and action. The momentum built steadily, propelled by the undeniable truth that economic justice was a cause that transcended party lines. JD often visited these communities, walking factory floors alongside workers, listening to their stories, and sharing in their triumphs and challenges. Each visit reinforced his belief that policy must be rooted in lived experience, guided by empathy and a genuine commitment to change. At a rally in a revitalized steel town, JD addressed the crowd with renewed passion. "We are not here to repeat the mistakes of the past," he proclaimed. "We are here to build a future where American workers are valued, where their labor is honored, and where the promises made are promises kept." The crowd erupted in cheers, the air thick with a collective sense of purpose and possibility. It was a moment of reckoning and renewal, a declaration that the fight for fairness was far from over, but advancing with newfound strength. As the sun set over towns once shadowed by neglect, a sense of renewal took hold. The scars of economic hardship remained, but so did the resilience and hope of a people determined to reclaim their place. With leaders like J.D. Vance championing their cause and communities rising in solidarity, the future seemed brighter. This time, J.D. thought quietly, the promises will be kept. J.D.'s return to Ohio was nothing short of triumphant. As he stepped off the plane at the small regional airport, he was immediately enveloped by a wave of familiar faces, vibrant banners, and the soulful strains of a local band playing a lively tune. The air was thick with emotion. Tears of joy mingled with smiles of relief and renewed hope. Community leaders, union members, and families lined the streets, their cheers echoing through the crisp autumn morning. It was a homecoming that transcended politics. It was a celebration of resilience and a shared dream finally within reach. The journey from the airport to the heart of town was punctuated by heartfelt greetings and embraces. Children waved flags painted with slogans like "Jobs for Ohio" and "We Stand with JD." Elderly steelworkers, their hands marked by decades of labor, clapped JD on the back, their eyes shining with gratitude and recognition. For many, this moment symbolized not just a victory, but a restoration of faith in leaders, in community, and in the possibility of a better future. As JD approached the gates of the once silent steel mill, his pace slowed. The massive entrance, long shuttered and weathered by time, now bore the signs of rebirth. Fresh paint gleamed under the morning sun, and the sound of machinery hummed faintly in the background, a soundtrack of hope returning to forgotten places. Families gathered nearby, some reuniting after years of hardship, others sharing stories of struggle and perseverance. The sight was deeply moving, a vivid reminder of what had been lost and what was now being reclaimed. JD paused, taking in the scene with a quiet reverence. He felt the weight of their hopes, the scars of their sacrifices, and the promise of what lay ahead. Turning to a group of workers, he shared words that resonated with the spirit of the moment. "We didn't just stop a bad deal, we started something better." His voice carried the conviction of a man who understood that true progress required more than policy. It demanded heart, courage, and a willingness to fight for what is right. The crowd responded with heartfelt applause, their energy a powerful affirmation that the journey was far from over, but that meaningful change had taken root. Conversations bloomed around JD, plans for retraining programs, community initiatives, and further legislative efforts designed to secure and expand the new wave of opportunities. The mill was more than a building. It was a beacon of renewal, a symbol that hard work and persistence could revive even the most battered communities. As the day wore on, JD visited families in their homes, schools, and local businesses, listening to their stories and offering reassurance. Each encounter deepened his commitment to the cause and underscored the interconnectedness of policy and people. The challenges remained vast, but so did the determination to meet them head-on. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the town, JD stood atop a modest hill overlooking the mill. The sounds of laughter, music, and conversation drifted upward, a testament to a community reclaiming its voice and its future. In that moment, JD allowed himself a rare smile, knowing that this was more than a political victory. It was a legacy in the making. With the stars beginning to twinkle overhead, JD whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but together, they had taken the first crucial step toward rebuilding a nation that honored its workers, its values, and its promise. The journey home was a reminder that true leadership is not measured by the battles won alone, but by the lives touched and the hope restored. And in the heart of Ohio, amid banners, music, and tears, that hope was alive and thriving. In a sunlit classroom tucked away in a small Ohio town, the hum of youthful curiosity filled the air. Rows of desks faced a large screen where a civics teacher paused the video and looked out over her students with a gentle smile. The room had just witnessed J.D. Vance's powerful speech, a stirring call for justice and the defense of those too often unheard. The words still lingered. Real courage means standing for those who have no voice. The teacher's voice softened as she addressed the class. What J.D. said today is more than politics. It's about bravery, about standing up even when it's hard, for the people who depend on us. A boy in the front row, eyes wide and earnest, raised his hand hesitantly. "Could I do that one day?" His question hung in the air, innocent yet profound, a spark of hope and uncertainty wrapped in youthful ambition. The teacher's smile deepened, warmth radiating from her as she replied, "That's the point." Her words were simple but carried the weight of encouragement and belief. You don't have to be a senator or a public figure to make a difference. Courage comes in many forms, and it starts with caring enough to act. The classroom was silent for a moment, the question echoing in the minds of every student. Some exchanged glances, others nodded slowly, the message sinking in deeper than any lesson from textbooks or lectures. It was a moment where education transcended facts and figures, reaching into the realm of character and conscience. Outside the window, the familiar sounds of the town blended with the quiet resolve growing inside those walls. The community, still healing from economic hardships, found new inspiration in the next generation. Children who might one day carry the torch for justice, equity, and progress. The teacher continued, sharing stories of ordinary people who had stood tall against odds, reminding her students that history is shaped not only by famous leaders, but by everyday acts of courage and kindness. She encouraged them to see themselves as part of that ongoing story, with the power to influence the future in ways big and small. In the back of the room, JD's speech played again briefly, his voice steady, his message clear. It was more than a call to action. It was a legacy passed on, a lesson living on in the hearts of those who would listen and choose to stand. As the class prepared to move on, the teacher left them with one final thought. The world needs brave voices, but it also needs brave hearts, and every one of you has both. The boy tucked his hands under his chin, a newfound determination shining in his eyes. Around him, the room buzzed softly with the possibilities of what courage could mean, today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come. This classroom, like many others across the country, became a quiet beacon of hope, proof that the fight J.D. Vance had ignited was far from over. It lived on in these young minds, ready to rise when called upon. And somewhere in that hope, the future began to take shape. As dawn's first light gently illuminated the city streets, J.D. Vance stepped out into the quiet hum of a world awakening. The air was crisp, carrying the subtle promise of change, and the city's familiar rhythm was infused with a renewed sense of purpose. Sidewalks that once felt heavy with uncertainty now seemed alive with possibility. People moved with a lighter step. Conversations carried hope instead of despair. And the shadows of the past gave way to the soft glow of a new day. JD's hand instinctively reached into his jacket pocket, fingers closing around the small steelworker's pin he always carried, a humble yet powerful emblem of the men and women whose lives he had vowed to fight for. It was a constant reminder that his work was not about politics or personal gain, but about real people, real struggles, and the dignity of labor that built this nation. As he walked, the city slowly stirred to life around him. Shopkeepers opening doors, children heading to school, workers gathering at bus stops. JD's thoughts drifted through the journey that had brought him here, from the silent mills and crowded hearings to the fervent rallies and hard-fought victories. The path had been fraught with challenges, moments of doubt, and fierce opposition. Yet amid it all, a single truth had remained steadfast. Meaningful change demands more than words. It requires courage and relentless action. He paused briefly at a corner, watching as a small group of factory workers shared a quiet conversation, their faces marked by years of perseverance and hope. J.D. felt a surge of gratitude for their resilience, their unwavering spirit that refused to be broken by broken promises or shifting policies. Their strength fueled his resolve, a reminder that progress was measured not by headlines, but by the lives touched and transformed. The city skyline, bathed in the soft hues of morning, stretched before him, a mosaic of history and future intertwined. J.D.'s reflections settled deep within. Nations aren't saved by noise or empty declarations. They're saved by those who care enough to act, who step forward when it's hardest, and who bear the weight of responsibility with unwavering conviction. With each step, J.D. carried the weight of that promise. The fight ahead would demand more persistence, more voices raised, and more hearts committed to justice. But in the quiet dawn, surrounded by the awakening city, he found hope. The journey was far from over, but the foundation was laid and the future was theirs to shape. As the sun climbed higher, casting its warm light over the streets and faces below, J.D. walked forward, not just as a man who had challenged the status quo, but as a guardian of a vision where the American worker's value was recognized and honored. The path was uncertain, but the purpose was clear. And so, with the steel worker's pin pressed lightly in his hand, J.D. moved onward, ready to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, it is not the noise that changes a nation. It is the quiet courage of those who dare to stand and act. This story reminds us that true change comes from courage and commitment, not empty words or fleeting promises. J.D. Vance's journey highlights the power of standing up for those often unheard, proving that one voice can spark a movement. It inspires us to act with integrity and resilience in the face of challenges. What small step can you take today to support your community or stand up for what matters most? How will you be part of the change? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.